Hey fearsome friends, light your campfires, get those blankets and beers, and get ready for some terrifying tales. Sit back, relax, and get cozy, comfy, warm, because it's time to let your nightmares in. The following story is from a friend of mine, and she gave me full permission to upload it. One day I was walking home from my job, and it was late shifts that I was doing, and I needed the money because I was in deep college debt. I found a bus stop up ahead, and there was a light post next to it. It would only flicker occasionally, though each time it did, the light dimmed, almost making me invisible to the human eye from a distance. I was already unsettled from the atmosphere of this area, as it was very secluded, and was just a small post by the street. I looked at the timetable once more, then I checked my phone and it said 3:40. The next bus arrived at 4 o'clock. I sighed a breath of both relief and stress, as I didn't want to be out for long, considering it was getting cold, and I was starting to scare myself. I felt really alone at that point. That was until some old man, about in his late 70s, came up to me. I was startled because I hadn't seen him come, so where exactly did he come from? It was almost like that video game NPC, when they appear and disappear in the blink of an eye. The time was already 4:06, and the bus hadn't arrived, so I was trying not to be rude as this old man was talking to me, and I impatiently waited for my bus to arrive. He caught on that I was uncomfortable, because he stopped talking to me as much. So I sat back down and recollected my courage to start up a conversation again, as he was talking to me about his dead wife and his kids, who were off at Ivy League colleges miles from home. I almost felt bad for him. He was out here accompanying me, when he was all alone himself at home. From the distance then, I spotted smoke in the air and assumed there was a fire, but he assured me it wasn't, and it was just his inn. I looked at him puzzled. He had an inn by a creepy bus stop. He explained why he'd moved out here to be so secluded from everyone else, and he said, "Human life is complicated, and at times disrespectful. Before I moved out here, a young gentleman at a donut shop I visited from time to time bumped into me, knocking my items over, and he scoffed at me. After he spoke to me about it, he walked me over to his inn, and he saw that I was shaking, which made him feel awful, considering he was the only one wearing a coat. When we got to his inn, it was very small but cozy and warm. The fireplace was in the corner, and it was nice to be warm. He set me up some coffee and put out some baked goods, fresh from the oven, and I wasn't even worried about missing my bus at this point. It was better staying warm than freezing. We talked for what felt like hours as we snacked on croissants and drank hot cocoa. Eventually the time was 6:20, and I had to get home and shower for my early class at 9. He offered to drive me home, but I insisted on taking the bus as I didn't want to be rude or any trouble. He kept offering though, so eventually I gave in. Then he handed me his phone number as he dropped me off at my college campus and told me to ring him if there was ever an emergency. Now, though this old gentle spirit was kind to me, I had no idea what I was soon getting myself in for. Later that week, after the meeting at the bus stop, he texted me with a photo. I didn't check it until I was done with my finals, and when I opened it, I saw it was a photo he'd sent nearly 2 hours ago, and it was of the front of my campus school with no context. I was taken aback, but considering the character he fed me of himself, I didn't read into it sooner. That same week, he delivered me a basket of food from the cafeteria, and I was flattered, but didn't want to accept. So I texted him and told him it really wasn't worth the trouble. He ignored it though, but was marked as read. The next week I woke up and went to shower in the communal bathroom in the girls' dorm, and I discovered another basket with a note on it. It was a poem by Edgar Allan Poe. Inside the basket were baked goods and a small box with a ribbon. Inside the box was a rabbit's foot, and I could tell it was freshly cut from the dried blood of the fur. So I quickly dropped it back into the basket then threw it out. I messaged him then, asking him why he'd clearly sent me a dead rabbit's foot like it was a normal thing to do. It wasn't even clean and the bone was still visible. He'd read my message and replied with a photo of a pool of blood on the counter with blood marks in the sink. He then sent a second photo of the rabbit on the ground and a knife on the counter in the corner of the screen. I was deeply unsettled and overwhelmed, so I blocked his number. But by then it was too late. The gifts were getting sent regularly, and they were getting weirder than the next. I talked to the dean of the campus and explained to him what was going on. And law enforcement did get involved, but considering the law was corrupt, they barely did anything. I asked to switch dorm rooms, but I was unable to. So every day I would open my door to some weird-ass gift, until it finally stopped. Eventually the man was arrested, because some of the girls in the dorm had peeked through their doors whilst it was still early, and had found out exactly what was going on. This was 4 years ago, and I still live in the same area. I'm pretty sure he got a small sentence, which baffled me, but it doesn't matter now. He was released, and my P.O. box is still open to him. I'm now awaiting the day that I will receive another basket. And I say this because a day ago I was emailed a photo from an unsaved account with a photo of a bus stop. The one I was stuck at 4 years ago coming from home that late shift. So I, a 21-year-old female, go to university in a different city to where I live, so I have to take the train to get there. Every evening I walk home from the station, which is about a 15-minute walk, and I live in a relatively small town, in a country with a low crime rate, so usually I feel quite safe. I never run into anyone on my way home, if it's past 7 p.m, so I used to always think to myself, if someone with bad intentions actually did drive by me, I'm done for, as there would be no one around to help me. So one night a few months ago, I was walking back home. It was around 9:30 p.m. and I was walking past this stop walk when a white van stopped to let me cross. But they'd stopped in a really abrupt way and suddenly did a U-turn going back up the road, but in the wrong lane. So luckily there weren't any other cars, otherwise he would have caused an accident. He then proceeded to park further up the road, but the wrong way round, meaning the driver's side was next to the pavement. At that moment I got an uneasy feeling, but I just brushed it off. And just to clarify, there weren't any other ways I could have gone except that street, and there hadn't been any other cars going by for a few minutes, so I felt very vulnerable and very alone. I kept on walking, but I noticed the door on the driver's side was wide open and facing the sidewalk, but I hadn't seen anyone come out of the van. I thought to myself that maybe someone was just unloading something, so having the door open made things easier, and I just hadn't seen them get out. But nonetheless, I decided to call a family member and ask them about their day to distract myself. I didn't tell them what was going on though, because I thought I was just being paranoid. Carrying on my journey, I went past the van, avoiding the open door, but decided to check out the inside of it, just to see what the person looked like and what was going on. And you wouldn't believe it, but the guy was just casually masturbating, pants down with his member fully out. This had happened to me before when I was a kid, but this time, maybe because I'm older now, it felt a lot more serious. I think he expected me to be scared, because I have a younger looking face and some people might think I look super innocent. But I began yelling at him, telling him he was disgusting, etc. He didn't have a strong physique, so I didn't really feel threatened, but he acted all innocently, as if he didn't know what he was doing. Keep in mind I was still on the phone at that point, so the person on the other line was really confused. I took a picture of his license plate, and he then got scared and sped off. I was still cursing him until he was out of sight. Then I reported him to the police, and they found him. He got a small fine and that was it. But I guess at least now they know who he is. This event kind of freaked me out, as I was afraid of walking home alone at night for months afterwards. For a while I was a bit ashamed of how it had affected me, because it's not like I got physically or sexually assaulted. But now I realise it really wasn't okay. I know this story isn't as crazy as someone here, but I think I'm just using this as a way to talk about it and feel better. During a time in my late teens, early 20s, I was struggling with some serious issues and had made a rapid, lengthy amount of very poor choices, resulting in chronic homelessness. I spent most nights walking around, because in my mind, sleeping outside somewhere in the dark was far too dangerous, since I was originally from a very strict and sheltered home, as well as being a female with no street smarts or fight game. One night in particular it was very cold, so I was walking pretty fast to try and keep warm. It was past midnight, and where I was isn't a very large town, so the streets practically rolled up by 10 p.m. midnight, leaving little to no traffic. I was nearing the end of the block where I was going to have to cross the street, and as I approached the corner, I saw a really raggedy-looking truck, full of some pretty scary-looking guys. We locked eyes, and I realised that they were going to be right where I was going to be, and at about the same time, so I slowed down and signalled for them to pass by. When I did that, the driver gave an evil grin, shook his head no, and signalled for me to go. His buddies in the truck all started laughing and smiling, which of course made me very nervous. I started getting scared and waved them on insistently, because I felt safer with the idea of them being past me when I crossed the street. They looked pissed off now though, and I didn't think they were going to go. But finally they did. I was getting cold waiting, so as soon as they'd passed by, which they seemed to creep, I stepped off the curb and started to cross. However, all of a sudden, they instantaneously slammed on the brakes, threw it in reverse and gunned it, aiming their truck right at me. The angle and speed they were going made me run back in the direction I'd originally come, and I was now running and screaming in absolute terror. I watched them jump the curb and slam on their brakes after the back end of their truck had already cleared the sidewalk. Then in that exact moment, as I was watching them come to an abrupt stop, I had just landed safely on the grass right by the curb near the street, and basically almost where I'd originally started. I locked eyes again with the driver, and the look he had was one of a demented, angry psychopath who looked like they were enjoying themselves, but not satisfied with the results of not being able to run me over. All this had happened in the matter of mere seconds. Then the freaking maniac gunned it in my direction again. I instantly started sprinting back across the street in the direction I'd come from, screaming and running for my life now. And as soon as he'd stopped, he attempted to run me over again, barely missing me. This time when I started running, I did it full speed ahead without looking back, slowing down or stopping, and I could hear their tires squealing at what sounded like them attempting to stop, turn around and hunt me down. Like I said, I ran like the wind, cut through several yards, rounded a corner, jumped someone's fence and just sat down from exhaustion. I was taking a risk going into someone's backyard that late, but I didn't care. I sat there and closed my eyes, catching my breath and gathering my wits. I frantically reviewed what had just transpired in sheer terror, as I could hear the roar of their engine and the squeal of their tires for what seemed like forever, as they hastily ripped up and down the streets, seemingly looking for me. Finally I could hear them getting further and further away, giving me the courage to quietly slip out of the random backyard I had invaded. And talk about scary. I worried about having another accidental run-in with those psychos for a long time after that, and I've always been cautious, but that was one of the many events that burned into my psyche, moulding me into becoming a permanently hypervigilant person. Thank God I wasn't wearing headphones, which I never have and never will whilst walking. I've lurked and commented on this subreddit before, and I've been asked to share some stories. For some background, I worked as a cop for several years before becoming a forest ranger. I've had a post in a large US national park for a while now, and there are some things that I'll never forget. Creepy things that show the brutality and hatred humans are capable of. So let's get into it. I was on night shift, and I was patrolling the park looking for any type of illegal activity, drug use, prostitution or poaching, when I got a call about a man looking into a cabin where a summer camp was going on. So great, some creep probably jerking it to little girls. I blacked out, meaning I turned off my headlights and sirens, and parked a little ways down, walking in the hopes of catching the guy. When as sure as the sky is blue, I saw Homie was looking in through the windows. I began my approach and flicked on my flashlight, telling him not to move and show me his hands. He turned around, looked at me and started apologizing. Then I put him in handcuffs and detained him, whilst I searched him and waited for backup. I found his ID, a knife and some miscellaneous objects, then put him into another officer's vehicle whilst I made contact with the counsellors. They'd stated they had seen him earlier in the day, but had thought nothing of it. After taking statements, I ran his name, and yeah, he's a registered sex offender. I opened the door to talk to him, which wasn't my proudest moment, but I was tired and he was looking at little kids, and I said, "What the F do you think you're doing, you sicko?" He looked me in the eyes with no reaction, and said to me in a cold, monotone voice, "I was able to smell them. They're ready to breed, officer." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just closed the door. Then I stayed on scene for the rest of the night to ease everyone's mind and act as a deterrent. Obviously he ended up being charged, and thinking about what he'd said and the way he'd said it still makes me feel sick to my stomach. He's now banned and I believe still in prison, where creeps like him should stay forever. He ruined a great outdoor experience and may have scared these poor kids from camping, hiking, fishing or hunting and just enjoying the outdoors for the rest of their lives. I could go on and on about some of the awful people I've heard, seen and responded to, but cases involving children in any way are the worst. I'm an 18-year-old female, and one day I went to the beach with friends and my boyfriend. It was a hot day, so we had fun at the park. Then in the evening went to Brighton Beach and took some pictures of the sunset. I was having a great time with my friends Jay, a 19-year-old male, E, an 18-year-old female, her boyfriend D, who was 18, and my boyfriend who was 19. We were sitting there, my friend and I wearing shorts because it was hot, but the temperature was slowly starting to cool down now, so D left to catch a train home. Suddenly a drunk old man in his 60s approached us, and I could sense something was wrong, so I asked him about himself and he sat down with us. He seemed friendly enough and was just looking for human interaction. I like helping people and talking to strangers, and he seemed to take a liking to me, but I didn't think much of it. Basically, he told us about his messed up past, how his brother had committed suicide, his dad had prostate cancer, and he'd gotten it too, and now only had 6 months to live. We were quite drunk, so honestly we weren't all there. He then told us about how in the morning he's going to jump off a cliff and kill himself. He described his messed up life, self-harm, and being raped, etc. But obviously I didn't want him to kill himself. So I opened up about my past too, sexual and physical abuse as a child, and it seemed to have really helped him. He took my hand and started stroking it, which I didn't mind because he was just looking for comfort, and we'd already been talking for about 45 minutes. He was still holding my hand and stroking the top of it, as my friend was telling him about her past too, and reassuring him that it gets better, etc. He took both our hands, which was fine. Then he said we were like his sisters, and that he's homeless and lives on the beach. He said he didn't care about himself and only cared for other people. And I asked him, "What makes you think you aren't worthy of being cared for?" And he burst into tears, saying he didn't know. I really felt for him, as I take on too many burdens from others because I want to help as well. By this point it was getting colder, and I was still in just shorts and a linen top, because I'd given my hoodie to E. I'm really good at dealing with the cold, as my body usually projects warmth. Then the man touched my legs and said, "Oh, you're boiling. Why are you so warm?" Then touched my friend's legs and said she was freezing. We were still quite drunk, so I didn't really think much of it. And before all of this had happened, he was talking about how he respects everyone, especially women, and any man who is disrespectful to them has him to deal with. He told my boyfriend to take care of me, etc., and I asked if he likes jelly beans. So I gave him a bag I'd gotten from a store a few hours ago. My friends gave him a chocolate bar, as we didn't really have any proper food. Then he looked at me and said, "You're stunning, absolutely stunning." And without sounding vain, I have thick, very long curly hair, dyed red, which gets a lot of compliments, an hourglass figure and long legs and a pretty face. I'm not usually freaked out when a stranger calls me pretty, so it didn't really raise any red flags. Then he called my friend pretty too. We gave him more offerings and decided it was time to go get some food, as it was about 8 p.m. My boyfriend and I were going on a date that night, and my other two friends went off to get some food separately. So we got up and said our goodbyes, and he placed a kiss on my hand, hugged each one of us a few times, but on the last hug he kissed E's forehead and then hugged me and lingered a kiss on my jaw. He touched my back and then said, "Oh, you're like a furnace." And it was over so quickly and slowly, I didn't know what to do. At the time we were all a bit like, what the hell just happened? But that was yesterday, and I talked to E about it, and she said it made her so uncomfortable, and I felt the same. After we left him, we all agreed to meet today and give him more blankets and food. But we talked about it, and figured he must have been making some of what he'd said up, because it was so elaborate and practiced, it can't have happened. I talked to a friend who always hangs out on the beach, and she said she knows of him, and that he's a bit weird. He's not dangerous, but definitely messed up, and he tells everyone he's going to kill himself, so she advised me to stay away. Around 9 to 10 years ago, I moved from Scotland to Ireland to live with my now ex. We moved into a small village on the outskirts of Dublin, and there was a large country park between where we lived and Dublin. We'd been to this park many times, and would take the dog there to walk and chase his ball. It was a lovely place, and being from the centre of a big city, it was a nice treat for me to experience the outdoors. One day my partner and I drove to the park with the dog, and everything was cool. We were playing with the dog, then decided to take a walk through the park. It was big with lots of different areas and hidden gardens, and I'd clocked a guy when we'd first arrived, cycling in circles around one small specific area. Straight away I thought it was off, and I don't know if it was because I'm from a rough area, as maybe I notice stuff and take it too seriously. And I'm paranoid maybe. But whatever it was definitely off. The area was too small to just be going in circles, but my ex told me to relax, as he was probably just doing laps, getting some exercise. About 30 minutes later we headed over towards the circling guy, as we wanted to go to the small petting farm that was there. We got to the area with the cyclist still continuing his circles. He'd passed us 3 times, and this dude was oozing bad vibes. On the 4th pass, he swerved behind us, jumped off his bike and screamed, What did you just say to me? Now, I'm used to weirdos being from where I'm from, so I just tried to calm him down. Nothing at all, pal. We were talking to each other. Sorry if you thought otherwise. Catch you later. I then ushered my ex in front of me, got the dog on the lead and kept walking, keeping myself between them. He cycled off then, and he turned around once we'd gotten to the most secluded area. But the dude started cycling towards us then, and jumped off his bike, suddenly pulling a massive blade from his backpack. And this thing was made from some sort of hedge cutter. It had been filed down to points all over, and had a makeshift handle of wood and gaffer tape. As he got closer, I stepped towards him and told him he was making a huge mistake. Now, I'm not tough by any means, but I have a dodgy leg and can't even run if I wanted to. There was a crazy shouting standoff between us, and I told my ex to just run. Finally, he saw someone else come around the corner and bolted. Then I caught up with my ex, and we decided we needed to tell the park authority about the incident. So we phoned the guards. This is where it got even creepier. We arrived at the park authority office and explained to the two people that were there what had happened. And when we described it, one of the park guys started becoming really shifty, saying he didn't believe us. He thought he knew the guy and said he was going to get him. Now, my description of him was pretty crappy, and it wasn't until I mentioned the blade that the dude took a real interest. Myself, my ex, and the other park guy, who I think was a trainee or something, suggested he call the police instead. The guy then ran out of the office and jumped in a van, and this was just getting weirder and weirder. So we phoned the police ourselves. When the police got there, we told them our story, and they went looking for the guy and the park ranger dude. It turned out that the two guys knew each other. The park guy told the police that he'd confronted the cyclist guy, who was just a casual acquaintance, and he denied doing anything wrong, so he just let him go. So long story short, the police couldn't find the guy or do anything because the park official said he didn't know where the guy lived, etc. They did find the weird machete though, which had been discarded. A couple of years later, I was visiting Dublin again, and my old business partner told me there had been a string of attacks and attempted attacks in the park and the surrounding area. The victims and witnesses had said the attacker had carried a homemade machete. But the thing that worried me is that this guy at the park knew all about him and had something to do with him. By lying and letting him go, he had helped this guy continue to attack people. We were really lucky that day, but it's a real shame others weren't. A few years ago, I was working at a cellular business where we assisted customers with contracts and so on. During this time, I met an extremely well-presented man that was at the centre for something else, and we crossed paths and started a conversation. He seemed like a nice guy, and we ended up exchanging numbers, and for the next few days after, we regularly had a chat. But he was always vague when it came to questions relating to his past, like where he's from, what his social media links were, etc., etc. I ended up thinking this dude must be married, and told him that I wasn't into that. He reassured me that he wasn't either, and eventually we arranged to have lunch. He was extremely into what I was about, what I liked, and talked only about me and nothing about himself. I know, I'm a dumbass. Fast forward to when he had invited me to a barbecue where one of his friends and his friend's wife would be. The friend himself was really odd. I could see he had bad self-inflicted, and I mean bad, wounds. He showed them to me and bragged about them, and was extremely hyper and talked a lot. We ended up sleeping over because I didn't want to be driven home by someone drunk, and I didn't have my license yet. And that's when this dude became even weirder. It was so random that I could barely make sense of it, and everything literally took a 360 turn. One evening he phoned me and asked me what type of engagement ring I would like. I was so thrown aback that I started laughing. He instantly got pissed at me for it, so I explained my response and told him I think it's better that he cooled down, that whatever this wasn't for me, then said goodbye and put the phone down. But he began bombarding me with messages and phone calls, with me eventually answering to tell him to leave me alone. He freaked out and told me off for treating someone that loves me like that. And the best part was when I heard in the background how his mother had come into his room and started yelling at him, asking what the hell he was up to now. He's a grown man, for Christ's sake, and he said that he lived on his own. I blocked him on my mobile phone and constantly walked around looking over my shoulder because he knew where I worked. Then one day, as expected, he showed up at my work to apologize for his weird behavior and told me that it wouldn't happen again. I kept quiet and didn't say a word when he took out a wad of cash, placed it on my table and left. I gave the money to someone who needed it more, as I felt dirty keeping it. Then that's when I decided to Google the dude's name. I didn't know his last name because he'd always avoid telling me by changing the subject. And there he was, on the 7th page of Google, wearing prison clothes, along with 2 other drug-addicted looking people. He was part of the following article. Dustin Blom was strangled to death before his body was stuffed into the boot of his car and dumped in a casino parking lot in 2013. Days later, the decomposing corpse was identified by Blom's friend, Ryan PD, who could only positively identify his friend after seeing a tattoo on Blom's hip. Now I knew his surname. He was found innocent of the murder, but guilty of taking this poor dude's credit card and having a spending spree whilst this guy was decomposing in his own car. If you search Monte Casino Murder Johannesburg, it'll pop up. I was paranoid for months. I mean, what are the odds? At the time when this story began, I could never have imagined where it would lead to. I made many mistakes throughout, stemming both from my autism spectrum disorder and from genuine character flaws within my control. But I've come out of it wiser, and aware that if I'm not careful, I'll again be preyed on by people like the guy I encountered. A long time ago, I entered the scene of radical organizing. One of the first guys we took into our group stood out, in that he was possessed by an overwhelming zeal and enthusiasm. His passion was infectious, and me and my best friend within the group came to like him a lot. He was the most charismatic person we had ever seen, always cracking jokes, making speeches that reflected our beliefs, and telling interesting stories about his past. But before long, we began to see the downsides to his intense personality. First, it was relatively benign things, like him spanking his kids, or keeping his German Shepherd in an inhumane little cage for the vast majority of the day. Then it was the indications that he was a bit of a loose cannon, like when he blew up at one group member and excluded them from his home for a disagreement that could otherwise have been manageable. Then it was weird quirks, like him telling the same prison gang and fight stories 5 times over in an attempt to make us view him as a macho badass. Then it was the red flags that we ought to have recognized initially as concerning, like when he advocated for committing crimes against humanity in response to how much he hated the system. He once took me for a ride in his truck and casually said he hopes for nuclear missiles to drop on the United States, just so that we can see a real change in this country. He had ways of meeting people by supposed coincidence, with my friend saying he once had him basically sneak up behind him on the street. There were also sketchy things about his past, like how he used to want to become a Green Beret so that he could rack up a bunch of kills for the USA before he supposedly became a dedicated left-wing activist. At a certain point, his latent desire for violence escalated to the point where he threatened to fight someone on social media who we were having an argument with. Supposedly it was about defending me, but it was clearly nothing more than a macho, gang-banging outburst, which was bad optics to say the least. so my friend told him to hold off on doing things like that. Then the cycle of drama started. He left our group, and at the same time intensified his efforts to become close to me. He started regularly taking me on rides, inviting me to hang out at his apartment, and going on hikes with me. He and his family knew how to party, and I was having fun, but all the while was this weird undercurrent to it. He would spend sometimes hours at a time ranting to me about how much he disliked my other friend, and how my friend's desires for curbing recklessly violent speech was a sign that he was some kind of fake native. They both were part indigenous. One day, while taking me on a shopping trip, out of nowhere he said to me, "I don't trust you." While we were in the parking lot, he looked behind us like he was noticing something threatening and said, "My spidey senses are tingling." He declared to me that we don't need society after breaking from everyone else in my circle. At a later point, he got mad that Mexico lost to Canada at soccer, then drove around town looking for Canadians to go after. Did he think he'd recognize them by their maple hats or something? I found he had 0 friends besides me, for reasons that were becoming apparent. He had a habit of popping in, driving up to my house spontaneously, without regard for boundaries. He talked about stalking, describing elaborate hypothetical plans for tracking down and assaulting my friend and the others in the group for supposedly having wronged him. He told an outrageous story about my other friend having said the N-word, even though this was wildly out of character for the allegation's target. I often felt myself getting creeped out, while not wanting to face why. Then he friended me on Facebook, and got into a confrontation with my other friend over some stupid drama. While trying to cancel my friend on social media, he said, "If I ever test positive for COVID, I'll be paying a visit to your place," in the context of him having brought up my friend's older dad and stepmom. Then he started trying to isolate me from all my other friends, claiming I needed to cut them off in order to be truly principled. I politely refused, now aware that he might come after me or my family if I ticked him off. Then he cut me off for several months, before reaching out to me again. I should have cut him off right after the inciting incident, and made clear to him that I shared my friend's disapproval of his loose cannon way of operating, but I allowed myself to be manipulated into being passive, and this had consequences. A couple weeks before the 2020 election, I briefed him on the news about the potential for political violence in the coming days. This evidently sparked inspiration in him, because 10 days later, he invited me on a very strange drive. While I rode with him, he asked me questions about how close I felt the country's situation was to civil war. During this conversation, he drove up to my friend's house asking, "Is that his house?" As if he didn't know. Then he asked, "When was the last time you've been to that house?" To which I answered honestly, saying I'd recently gone there. A few days later he cut me off again, this time because I had supposedly betrayed the movement by going to the house. Half a year later he reached out to me again, later saying he had forgiven me for my supposed wrongdoing of not cutting off my other friends. On and off we hung out again, though now I consciously didn't trust him. But he had ways of charming me, relating me about topics I'm passionate about, and building up my self-confidence through encouraging banter, and it seemed like things would return to normal, like things were ever normal with this guy in the first place. The cracks in his facade began to show when he took me on another drive. He didn't pull up to my friend's house this time, but he explained the thought process behind why he had done so previously. He said he was asking me for information on the present political tensions so that he could decide whether the 2020 election was the right moment to go on a murder spree. He described a scenario where he would drive me across the area and take me to help him pick off individuals he felt had to go. He then told a story where he had caught his old girlfriend throwing a party without him, pulled out a knife, and went after one of the guys, the Halloween music playing in my mind, he said. He then described a scene where he got within an inch of stabbing his target before the poor dude's car kicked into gear at the last second. I was more concerned than ever, of course, but I was also more inclined than ever to appease him to keep myself safe. That was another mistake of mine. A few weeks later, he texted me a link to a gore video, saying these things happen in war. If you can't handle this, war is not for you. It wasn't until I talked about this incident to my other friend, the one who got targeted with the N-word accusation, that I was made to realize just how dangerous of a situation I was in. According to my friend, those kinds of videos are extremely illegal. A claim that I found was mistaken, upon further research when it comes to the specific kind of content this guy shared, but nonetheless shook me in the moment. And as my friend concluded, these attempts to pull me into destructive acts wouldn't end here. Sure enough, the guy at one point basically described how he would screw me over, saying if you and I ever go to prison for beating someone up, the Nazis will be trying to recruit you. I've since cut him off, which was as easy as finally making it clear that I did not appreciate the way he had defended me by threatening violence against someone in a sensitive public context. I said to him that I'm capable of defending myself, which applies to my current situation, where I'll likely have to pepper spray him if I ever meet him out and about. While freaking out at me, he demanded that I clear his name, but there's nothing I could ever say that will clear his name at this point. Several years back, I was cleaning out the house I'd been renting for about a year, and my lease was almost up. I wasn't going to be living there the next year, so it was time for me to start cleaning it out and moving my stuff to my next place. The house that I had had at the time was fairly small, but was perfect just for me. I lived there by myself, and I had just finished cleaning out the living room, other than some basic furniture. Then I moved on to the kitchen. There were quite a few cabinets, so many in fact that I ended up not even using half of them. But as I was looking through some of the ones that I didn't use, to make sure that there was nothing I had in them, I saw something in the back corner. It looked like some type of shirt or rag. So I grabbed it and saw that I didn't think it was mine, but when I moved it revealed a small white lever that I could barely see. The cabinet was in the corner, sort of by the sink, and halfway blocked by the stove. I thought it was just another pipe, but it looked a little different to me. I got inside the cabinet, which was pretty large, and I saw there was a small trapdoor to the side, leading into the wall. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. You had to be completely inside in order to see the detail of it, so I tentatively decided to open the trapdoor, which then led to an extremely narrow hallway with a sort of crawl space. When I got further inside, though, I was horrified. I could see that there was food, as well as several blankets, as if someone had been living inside it. The good news, at least, though, is that whoever was in there before was gone now, and I tried to make sense of it and figure out how long the person had been there and how exactly I hadn't known about it before. I was gone from the house a lot with work and other stuff, but I didn't know how it was possible for someone to live in there without me knowing. I continued cleaning until it got pretty late, and the next day after work I continued. I was still kind of in shock with finding a secret room in my house and decided to take another look at it. I opened the cabinet and went inside. Then I pulled the lever open just like I had before. But this time, as soon as I opened it, I saw movement, then a person for a split second. They slammed the door shut on me, and I immediately turned and ran to my car outside, immediately calling the police. I was so scared that I started driving away as I told the police the whole situation. They came to my house a short time later to find that whoever had been there was now gone. Luckily for me, I moved out the next week, but I really don't know how long that person had been living in that secret room, and thankfully they never gave me any problems. I would always suggest that you lock your doors, because you can never know what people do when they are in your house. My name is Maria, and I'm 23 years old. I live in a small town called Cedarburg in Wisconsin, and here there is an urban legend about a murderer called the Baguette Basher. It was a story of a baker from 1931 called Jonathan Arthur, who was a small fat man and was admired and favourably looked upon by the Cedarburg residents. The story goes, one busy morning in his bakery, a hooded figure about 5'2" in height and rather large around the waist came into the shop and groaned. Jonathan continually asked the mysterious figure to order or get out, but all he was met with was drowning groans from the person, who repeatedly kept making funny noises. Jonathan lost his patience and launched himself over the counter to throttle the chubby groaner, and most of the other customers ran out of the shop terrified. Except, that is, Lance Mattenberger, the local newsman, who helped Jonathan restrain the hooded figure. After 20 minutes of struggling, Jonathan had had enough and grabbed a fresh baguette out of the oven before repeatedly bashing the groaner over the head in an attempt to knock them out. The groaner stopped struggling, and as the two men pulled the hood back, Jonathan was horrified to see his own mother looking back at him blankly, eyes wide and mouth open. She was dead. The post-mortem revealed that his mother had been having a stroke, and died as a result, with her misinterpreted groans being a cry for help. Rumour suggested that Jonathan had committed suicide, and no one had seen him again, and the once renowned baker was now a disgrace in the town. However, murders began occurring, and one eyewitness claimed to have seen a short, chubby man beating his victims with a long object. One might even assume it was a baguette. Hence became the legend that is, the Baguette Basher. My mum told me the story when I was younger, as many other mothers did, as a means of keeping their children from roaming the streets at night. But no one believed it, of course. However, hearing it as a child, the story remained with me for years, and despite me now being old enough to realize the silliness of it, I would never forget how terrified it made me and my brother Sean when we were younger. I have since moved away from that town to attend the University of Wisconsin in Madison, where I study French literature, and I have done a year abroad in Lille, and all but forgotten about the story. I have had some flings in college, but nothing too serious, and still use dating apps such as Bumble and Tinder. But I was recently back in Cedarburg to see my family, and stayed with my brother Sean, who now works in construction with my dad. So as my whole family was visiting, my childhood home was full. One night, me, Sean and his friend Chase were just chilling in his house, watching some movies and having some beers. I was scrolling through Bumble and found an old schoolmate of mine, Brett, who also happened to be in town. We got chatting and arranged to meet up that night to get some drinks at the local bar. So I quickly got ready and began walking there, which wasn't far from my brother's house. It is a small town after all. I arrived at the bar, but Brett wasn't there, and he had texted me to say he'd be another 10 minutes. I decided to go out back to have a smoke while I waited, and as I lit up, I heard a rustling in a bush about 20 meters away. The bar is in front of a woods. It wasn't dark, so I walked over to have a closer look, and heard rustling again, but this time slightly further back. I was a bit startled, but assumed it was probably just some animal, and began walking back towards the bar, when all of a sudden, a hooded figure screamed and charged towards me. I was in heels, so I initially stumbled out of sheer fear, but I managed to compose myself and get back on my feet, as I ran as fast as I could whilst throwing anything I could to put the pursuing man off, including my $50 lighter rather annoyingly. I ran in through the bar door and instantly people were startled by my obvious panic. Brett, who had just arrived, ran over to me and asked what was wrong. So I described to him that a small, rather chubby man ran at me from the woods, holding what appeared to be a long, thin object, like a baguette. Brett walked me home, and neither the staff at the bar nor the cops could find anything, and nothing else has happened to me in any recent visits to my hometown. But one thing's for sure. That so-called urban legend that my mum told me when I was younger terrifies me even more now. One day, I was lying on my bed, bored, so I decided to add people on Snapchat's quick add to try to make some new friends. I came across this one girl that seemed really nice, and she lives in the same town that I did. She was 18 and I was 20 at the time, and she said I could come over at such and such time in the early afternoon. She gave me the address and I drove there, but I was waiting for almost 30 minutes at least, wondering where she was, as she'd said she would meet me and would be there soon. She finally showed up with her friend, who was a girl that I had no idea was coming. But I happened to know this other girl, so it wasn't completely awkward. We all went inside then and had a chilled night. All was going well and nothing was out of the ordinary. We were all just talking and having a good conversation, as they'd also had many other people over that same night. Almost a week later, this girl that I'd added on quick add asked to hang out and came to pick me up at my apartment one afternoon. She was also with the same friend I'd met up with that other night, and we started driving around in her car. I was in the back seat and they were in the front, and nothing out of the ordinary occurred. Then a couple of days later, I invited them over to my apartment so we could talk and chill just as usual around my kitchen table. They asked if it was cool if they could invite a couple of their friends over, and I said I didn't mind. Then fast forward a couple of hours later, as everyone had left and I was home alone, waiting for the two to come back like they said they would. They did come back, then they both decided they were going to pick something up from the original address I'd met them at. Now, whilst one of the girls was inside the house getting food, the other girl had begun to ask me some very obscure questions while simultaneously recording me out of nowhere. Here I was, thinking she was kind of goofy, so I didn't really think much of it. But then she asked me if I thought the other girl was gross. I jokingly but regrettably said yes, even though I thought this was all supposed to be funny and just for fun, so I didn't actually mean any of it. The other girl returned from getting food when her friend then showed her the video, and she became very mad at me. She drove back to my apartment, kicking me out of her car. Then about 30 minutes later they came back and said something along the lines of, "Did you really think we were seriously going to let you off that easily?" I regrettably then went back outside and got into the back of their car, when all of a sudden, as they were driving, they both said to me, "We're going to kill you." "You can't be serious," I replied, one of the girls telling me to shut up. I told her to shut up, as I was more than fed up with their BS by this point, which, yes, was an extremely stupid thing to have said, and only made the whole situation worse. I just wanted to get the hell out of that car. But they continued to tell me that they were going to kill me. When they stopped at the local Walmart and lied to me about going into the men's bathroom and finding money beneath the trash can closest to the main entrance. They told me to find it and come back out and give it to them, even though I knew they were flat out lying. When I got out of the car, I walked inside the entrance and tried to hide myself so I could see if they were going to drive off. But they just sat there in the car for about 5 minutes, eventually driving off, not knowing if they could see me. My phone's battery was very low at this point, and everyone I knew at the time was busy and wouldn't be able to drive over and pick me up to take me home. I ended up walking back home the entire way, which felt like forever, and the whole experience left me traumatized to say the least. I later found out that they'd both just ended up going home and drank that night with some friends, and probably didn't care if I was okay or not. I cried so hard that night, and keep in mind I was a 20-year-old male, and it takes a lot for me to get emotional. I swear it gave me PTSD, and I think about this day quite a bit. Who knows? Maybe they actually could have killed me. Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my video. And if you did, could you please give me virtual hugs by subscribing and clicking that notifications button. I also have a Patreon page and YouTube channel membership if you'd like to support me further. Thank you again for being here. keep being creepy.